Hello everyone, this is Zoltar and welcome to Game 1 in our best of 3 third place match between Gameslayer and SorenJohnson. As you can see, once again we're on Beta 3 playing with the Reveal Map mode, and this is another one that's looking not particularly forgiving for our players. Very small amounts of both carbon and iron available on this map. SorenJohnson already kind of noticing this fact. Wow, huge chunks of this map also covered in these spires of awfulness. I think the map size may have been set to medium instead of small this time, since I started the lobby with 4 players. On the other hand, I don't think anybody's going to object to that. Given the starting resources and how they're distributed, we basically ended up with a small map anyways. So we'll see what these players decide to do when it comes to founding. Already about half the amount of debt that they would receive. They may both just wait till no debt whatsoever, as neither place is particularly good in any way. I guess one thing a player could do is try and grab up a lot of the water initially. Get some of this iron established over here or over here. We do have Soren going ahead and just throwing down scientific. Gonna grab a couple of steel mills on the iron tiles that are actually on what I'm gonna call the mainland, and not separated off like this iron is off on its island. Well, it's legitimately an island, separated by these spires. That's ridiculous. So Soren going ahead and establishing early iron production and grabbing up a medium aluminum. Gameslayer trying to block him off from that medium aluminum. Unfortunately, he does not manage to get it. Instead, he's going to be taking some high aluminum for himself, some medium water, because water is not looking nice this map, and that can be an easy way to kind of shut down a scientific player, keep him away from water. And he's also going to be taking the high iron for himself. So that'll be 2 iron a second for Gameslayer, 2 aluminum, 1.5 water, whereas Soren is already pumping out steel and aluminum. Both of these players not going to be the fastest to push for upgrades. Soren should get there before too long if he wants. There it is. Being a scientific player, that's very, very easy to do in Beta 3. And now Gameslayer is just going to be kind of holding on, trying to get that steel bought up so he can push to HQ level 2 fairly quickly. Soren, with his new claims, is deciding to grab up a couple of waters, including the medium water. He has access to a couple of decent triangles here. There we go. Soren going ahead and cutting off his opponent from super solid adjacency bonuses, and also securing better tiles for himself in the future with these claims. Pirate auction coming out though. It's not what you want to see when you've gone scientific on a map like this. Not at all. This could go for very, very high amounts of money between Gameslayer and Soren. We'll just have to see exactly how high they're willing to push it. Not knowing exactly what its value will be later in the game. Obviously right now, not particularly nice thing to have, but later could make all the difference in the world. Gameslayer actually going to take that for 7,000. I imagine he's just going to hold on to that for quite a long time. No, in fact, he's going to throw down the pirates immediately. One thing to think about here is that Gameslayer does understand that Soren is going to want to use these tiles eventually. And so throwing down pirates here, Soren's going to go into water to kind of blast through the pirates, but it still slows Soren down. So instead of waiting for later, Gameslayer got those pirates fairly cheap, and so I suppose he is willing to just take a slightly lesser victory in stealing away water, making sure his opponent isn't making food yet, things of that nature, rather than waiting to actually steal the food directly itself. So an interesting thought there from Gameslayer. Both players getting down the typical steel production we would expect to see. 3 steel apiece going to be available in just a moment here. And we're starting to look toward HQ level 3. Now, Gameslayer is going to have to worry about iron's price this game. It's already up at $33, and it's going to keep going up for the time being as he's consuming 1 iron a second. He's going to have to be careful with his steel mills. Absolutely this game. Let's see. Also establishing additional water for himself is Soren, interestingly enough. I believe Soren's actually gone for an extra claim and used that to grab up this high water pump for 2 water a second. So water is going to be super low in price for a long time very soon. Soren almost certainly going to have to transition out of this water and then push for an upgrade is what I would expect to see from him. Pushing into either reactors or hydroponic farms, both of which should be making a fair amount of money at this stage. Once again, this is what I was worried about for Gameslayer. He's decided to scrap out of his steel because iron has just plain gotten too expensive, and he's going to make the move into farms himself immediately. Not a bad idea, I think. Farms making significantly more money. The big risk here is that it leaves Soren with complete control of the steel market. He could easily drive that price relatively high by just committing a lot of money into buying steel and trying to force Gameslayer to make another transition before hitting HQ level 3. Certainly Gameslayer does not want to have to do after having thrown down farms. He's really going to need to push to HQ level 3 off of just this so that he doesn't get locked out of the game by Soren buying up something like steel. Soren, in fact, has gone ahead and hit level 3 himself. And now we're seeing a transition out of him after hitting HQ level 3. One has to kind of wonder about it because it doesn't have any buildings headed its way yet. May have been better to make the transition and then claim new tiles, but still, not the end of the world for Soren. I imagine these will be farms or reactors like we would expect out of any scientific player on top of water, and once again, pirates come down. Not what you want to see. Not what you want to see if you're playing scientific. If he lets these go for 12,000, alright. These pirates be driven up to a bit more reasonable of a price. 16,000, you can still go much higher than that. But, oh, there it is. Alright. Pushing to 18. Gameslayer's going to push it to 20, of course. Soren seems nervous about this. I don't know why he's so nervous about debt, considering that stock prices are so high in Beta 3 these days. We can see Gameslayer just doing what he has to get a hold of this. Interesting plays from Soren. Not wanting to commit too much debt, not wanting to protect his resources quite as thoroughly. Gameslayer actually going to use his new claims to go into another farm and then some power. This leaves him with just 2 claims left. You have to wonder what exactly he's going to do with those. Alright, more wind turbines coming down, more power. It's understandable. Power has gotten quite expensive, although Gameslayer won't be making any money off of this anytime soon. And I'm very concerned for him if Soren decides to make the moves he needs to and blocks off Gameslayer's access to steel, blocks him from upgrading easily, drives up that price, maybe even drives up the price on glass in response, and just make it very, very difficult for Gameslayer to push to HQ level 4. But we'll have to see if Soren's going to be willing to make that play, and if he has enough alternate sources of income to be able to afford it. Alright. Gameslayer making just a little bit on power. I mean, it's stopping him from acquiring debt, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. Not a whole lot coming down. But it should be noted that Soren is not in any amount of power whatsoever, and he is running purely on steel mills and reactors, so he's going to be consuming all kinds of power per second. Once this last reactor has come online, we can already see 2 a second. That's almost 400 debt from power a second right now for Soren. Absolutely ridiculous. He's surpassed Gameslayer in debt quite nicely at this point. Despite Gameslayer being the one to take our first 2 auctions, Gameslayer's also moved into glass with his last claims. It looks as though he has purchased up a $6,000 new claim and established 2 glass furnaces. Those will be making decent money. You still have to wonder about the fact that they're not steel, but as we can see, he was not blocked out of steel effectively by Soren at all. Soren going ahead and selling down the steel that he had available to him. This is allowing Gameslayer to push to HQ level 4 and continue to get away with not having thrown down those buildings for a very long time. Immediately going to commit all of his claims to 1 glass furnace, 3 steel mills, and 1 wind turbine. This means Gameslayer is effectively into probably the most valuable production on this map in the combination of steel and glass, and then of course power paying off his debt quite nicely once you get those wind turbines established. More pirates. More bad news for Soren. Not what you want to see. I of course get blamed for the RNG. Hey, at least we get interesting games, right? Alright, 8,000 pirates. What are we going to have these go up to? I mean, I expect 20,000 again. It really should come for nothing less, in my opinion. Debt is just too freely available. We can see Soren, despite having however much debt he has, 98,000 debt. Soren's still at an almost, $10 stock price right there for Soren. It's absolutely ridiculous. He just upgraded his HQ, managing to stay afloat just fine. Gameslayer is the one who goes and grabs up those pirates. We can see his old pirates are actually still in place. They haven't managed to steal any oxygen or a whole lot of oxygen and fuel yet. And we'll have to see if he just holds on to these and waits, or what exactly he wants to do with them. Soren choosing to transition into a geotherm. Definitely a questionable decision right now, as steel is up to a $126 price. So having to spend 120 of it for Soren would be a bit ridiculous just to cover the cost of power. Might have been a bit simpler to throw down power instead of the reactors at this stage, especially as your opponent's going to be stealing half that money anyway. Soren is also attempting to move into glass furnaces, however. As we can see, his triangle was blocked off by Gameslayer. He's not going to have easy access to all this glass that he wants, and this transition is being very, very expensive for him because steel is still extremely expensive. So Soren, not in a good place right now. I'm having trouble finding an edge that he has. He is still scientific, so if things go a little, sideways, he can still continue to make things like the fuel and oxygen very easily. He will be able to continue to make this glass very effectively and ignore silicon's price if that gets driven up by the fact that Gameslayer is consuming a large amount of it. But things still aren't looking too pretty. Wasn't a great scientific map, and we can see that it's costing him, having to pay extra money for this steel mill, having to pay extra money for the silicon for these glass furnaces is not a spot that he's going to want to be in when he's already an HQ level down on his opponent. Gameslayer having hit HQ level 5, these wind turbines are going to be doing brilliant work for him during the dust storm, paying off a huge amount of debt if he mutinies them back, of course. So we'll just have to see how all of that pans out. There's also a chemical shortage going on. Soren attempting to buy into that, but he just doesn't have the free-floating cash to do it, whereas Gameslayer makes a much bigger buy, gets a decent sell and a decent sum of money off of that. Soren, even with a geotherm available to him and a wind turbine mutinied away, still not able to cover his power costs, so that's likely to continue to increase for some time. Gameslayer gonna make the move into Chem Labs after that shortage, very reasonable. Fuel has also been surplused down to $1 for the moment, so these Chem Labs should be making a lot of cash once they're online. Should be a very, very strong move for Gameslayer, who has also been stockpiling carbon for some time due to taking this medium carbon tile early on. Finally, we get an auction that isn't pirates. Alright, Gameslayer not going to let that go for 5,000. Good. This, once again, you kind of expect this to go in the 20 to 28,000 range as a claim auction. Maybe a little bit less valuable now that we're a little later in the game. But considering we are on Beta 3 with these high stock prices, games can continue to go on for quite some time. And that keeps the claim auction quite valuable, as it will still be online for a significant period of time this game. Going over to Soren for 20,000, that's fairly reasonable for a claim at this stage of the game. Can't really argue with it too much. One thing you can question is why neither player has committed into just a little bit more iron production. Iron's up at close to $100 right now. Ooh, an Offworld market coming down for Gameslayer. That's just fantastic for him. Let's go ahead and check Offworld prices. Oxygen up at 617. So that's going to be absolutely great for Gameslayer. Unfortunately, that's going to keep reactors in kind of an awkward spot until these Chem Labs have driven up the price on fuel. But Soren's been making oxygen quite nicely for some time, and so that oxygen price has stayed relatively low. And this off-world market is going to be extremely valuable for Gameslayer. We can see he has already got an extra Goon Squad purchased up for when the dynamite lands on this one. So he's got pretty much a guaranteed 2 launches for a lot of cash coming out of this off-world market very easily. Soren has managed to push to HQ level 5 finally, keeping his stock price above $10, but not very far above. So you still have to be a bit concerned about him at this stage of the game, starting to scrap out his glass furnaces to go into silicon production. Understandable, but he'll have to scrap the rest of these as well. There we go. And what does he do with these last 2 tiles? They can't get adjacency bonuses with the silicon without slant drilling. We're actually going to see Chem Labs come down for Soren. Reasonable decision at the moment. Chem Labs making a lot of money. Not as much as they were when Gameslayer started producing them, of course, but still, likely the right call. More Chem Labs coming down for Gameslayer. His electronics have been frozen out. Those were not making as much money as one might expect, despite the $300 electronics price, because silicon is so high from all this glass production, and of course aluminum is very high, as not a lot of it has been collected ever this game. But due to the fact that the resources were kind of spread out, kind of difficult to acquire. Neither of these players was rushing through upgrades, so we never saw aluminum spike to a completely ridiculous total, but $65 is still an awful lot, and is perhaps enough to be noticeable in its cut into Gameslayer's off-world markets, those requiring 20 aluminum to send up, in addition to their fuel cost and their base resource cost. Gameslayer has established both of his off-worlds at this point. He has basically no more investing to do. His launches have started, and therefore he has started getting aggressive against his opponent's stock. He has enough cash to secure at least one more stock easily, likely two, once he has sold out his chems. And we're just going to have to see exactly where the stock prices land in just a moment and see if Soren will have any way to defend himself in this game. Iron auction, not a bad thing right now. Iron's up at $161, you savages. Continuing to make steel despite that fact. And so this is actually potentially a really nice tile. It also gives Soren a moment to kind of look around the map and think things through, how he can manage to claw himself back into this game when he's gotten into such an unfortunate position. Now, the electronics move is certainly a good one out of Soren. Ignoring this silicon price for the time being, carbon would still be better, as it takes twice as much carbon to make an electronics factory as silicon. But you take what you can get, and it's certainly not a bad use of these nearby tiles for Soren. Finally, the auction goes to Soren for 20,000. We'll have to see if that does end up paying off in the long term, considering he acquired a whole bunch of debt to do it. Gameslayer going to secure the last little bit of Soren's stock, so he's going to have to only blast through 3 stocks at double value. So we're talking $106,000 for Gameslayer to end it. That's really just 2 off-world launches, if we're honest. Now 1, because he's up at $70,000. Also, a carbon surplus is absolutely fantastic for Gameslayer. That's going to allow his chem labs to function longer. It'll allow his electronics factories to make him a little bit more money. And he's going to get this cash well before Soren does. There's the red button. That's the end of the game. Gameslayer taking game 1 in this best of 3. Alright guys, let's check resources. We can see Gameslayer selling a lot of power. I mean, he covered his costs with it, right? He was not acquiring debt. Same could not be said for Soren for an extended period of time. Acquired a whole lot of debt despite not getting any auctions, maybe a bit late to that power transition. Gameslayer also selling a large number of chemicals to help clean up this game. Purchasing a lot of electronics, but that was for the off-world markets. An understandable decision. Even going 2 off-worlds that game, not the end of the world because he had such a huge lead that going for 2 markets basically guaranteed he would have it. Interestingly enough, making very little money on world, but it not mattering at the end of the day. He got to HQ level 5 and then set up those off-worlds the moment he could, and won the game very, very easily with them. Off-worlds making a huge difference. Very important to try and get a hold of. Soren, we can see a very different story. He also only made about 100,000 on world, having some trouble with steel, we can tell, purchasing 34,000 iron as scientific, not where you want to be. Also purchasing a large chunk of aluminum. So that's a bit of a concern as well. Just not able to move into the off-worlds, and then not able to hold on long enough because he had acquired so much debt. Just a few questionable decisions from Soren in the early game in particular relating to all the water that he had taken and was actually using as water, and maybe letting pirates go a little bit too early to force him into that position. If we check black market, there was not a lot of black market activity this game. Soren doing a little bit of work with mutinies, a dynamite, a couple power surges, and then 1 new claim and 1 goon squad. Whereas Gameslayer, he was getting hit by all of that obviously, but he still only purchased 1 new claim fairly early on, which we saw him use to establish just relatively okay production, I believe on HQ level 3, and then 2 goon squads for his off-worlds, and that's all he felt the need to do this game against his scientific opponent. Very understandable with their black market resistance. Alright guys, not too much special nonsense going on that game, so there's really not too much more to cover. It was just my resources are better than yours, deal with it, and let's move on to game 2.